Stan Gibilisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1, GV, Whiskey 1, Good Vibrations. I wonder if any of you have ever tried a little trick that I'm going to describe. I'm going to leave comments open. I wonder if any of you have ever tried it and what you've thought of the results. It involves the use of TV ribbon line. You know that old 300 ohm stuff? It's about a centimeter, well, it's a little less than a centimeter wide. Just a little less. Maybe about 3/8 of an inch, or maybe a little more. Pretty fine wire, probably number 18 gauge. It often used to be brown, although sometimes now you can find it in a kind of a translucent gray. You can get it at most hardware stores. You used to be able to get it at Radio Shack when they existed. You might still be able to find it at places like Walmart. But in any case, it has a characteristic impedance of about 300 ohms when dry. But when it gets wet, presumably the characteristic impedance goes down a little bit and the loss goes up a little bit. But when perfectly matched, for example, with a folded dipole antenna, which presents a characteristic impedance of 300 ohms purely resistive, if it's a half wavelength long, it's pretty good as far as loss goes. I believe I remember reading loss figures and finding that it's just about as good as perfectly matched RG8 or RG213, which is far more expensive. But that's when it's dry. So we're going to just assume that you've conducted this experiment when it's dry. Have you twisted that feed line when you bring it down? It's one line that you actually can twist into a helix without changing the spacing between the conductors, without running the risk of getting a kink in the line which causes the conductors to cross over each other and nearly touch. Were it not for the insulation, they probably would come into contact, but not with ribbon line. This stuff will retain its spacing because the dielectric is a solid web of polyethylene and will keep that spacing constant. Have you tried that? Maybe give one twist every, maybe 4 twists per meter. That would be about 1 every 10 inches or so. 1 complete revolution. The idea is that if there are nearby metallic objects, such as a telescoping mast or something like that, anywhere within maybe a fraction of a meter, a half a meter or a meter of the line, that by twisting it, you can sort of equalize the disruption between the two conductors so that they trade off as to which one gets coupled more to the obstruction and which one gets coupled less, and the end result is that the line has better balance when you twist it into a helix. And the same might be true if you run it through things like foliage, which can also get wet, and it has a certain inherent amount of water content anyway, or just as a matter of habit. Have you done this? And if so, have you noticed that it improved the performance of the line? And I might also ask you if you've noticed that if you have any kind of an antenna that's fed with ribbon line like this, the best example being an folded dipole antenna with either a transmatch or a 4-to-1 balun at the station end of the feed line. When it gets wet, have you noticed a deterioration in performance? Probably you won't have noticed it, but you will probably have noticed a change in the way the transmitter behaves, the tuning. If you have an SWR bridge, of course you're putting a 50 ohm SWR meter into 75 ohm line, and that'll give you a false reading to begin with, but not if you place it right at the transmitter. You should get about a 1.4 or a 1.5 reading if you have a well-matched antenna. Have you noticed a change in the SWR when it gets wet? Or if you have a transmatch, have you had to change the settings in order to make it tuned to a perfect match? I would suppose you have, but I'm asking you, have you noticed A, an improvement in performance when you twist the line into a helix, and B, have you noticed a deterioration or a change in performance when ribbon line gets wet and little drops of water form on that web of dielectric? Stangibelisco W1GV saying a very twisted, very wet 73, which means best regards in ham radio jargon, and so long, which means regardless of the water content. Da-da-da-da-da-da.